Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session at RightsCon 2020, Time for Facts, how are electronics manufacturers performing on human rights? Insights from KnowtheChain and the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. My name is Lourdes Montenegro. I will be your moderator for this session. I come from an organization called the World Benchmarking Alliance. I lead our work on digital sector transformation. As a brief background, the World Benchmarking Alliance is a global initiative that works to incentivize corporate contribution towards sustainable development goals. We work with over 150 allies, many of which are investors representing more than 6 trillion of assets in management. We publish publicly and freely available benchmarks across 7 systems, including the digital system. We will be publishing our debut digital benchmark this year, coming out in December. So look forward to that. For our session this afternoon, we have 2 panel speakers. We will start with Felicitas Weber from KnowtheChain, who leads the KnowtheChain project at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. And then we will have Camille, who is leading the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark at the World Benchmarking Alliance. After their presentations, we would like to invite the audience for an interactive dialogue. If you have questions and you have comments following the presentation, then please feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat your questions and your comments. We should get started. Just don't forget to let us know who you are if you are going to would like to participate in the dialogue. So let's get started with Felicitas.
Thank you so much, Lourdes. I'm really excited to be here with you all today. As Lourdes said, my name is Felicitas Weber. I'm with the Business and Human Rights Research Center, and I'm working on the KnowtheChain benchmarks. Let me just share my screen with you. So just to start with, what is KnowtheChain? So KnowtheChain, we're a resource that's really primarily focused on companies, but then also on investors, and trying to get those groups of stakeholders to understand, but also address forced labor risks in global supply chains. We do this around a range of sectors, but our primary focus is on these 3 high-risk sectors that you see here on the screen, one of which is the ICT sector, which is why we're here today. Like many of those things, we can't really do this on our own. So as I said, I'm with the Business and Human Rights Research Center, but we also work very closely with our partners at Humanity United, Sustainalytics, and Verite. So trying to get really labor expertise and investor expertise from a range of actors that are supporting us. And maybe just before we wanted to share, as Lourdes said, some of the findings of our benchmark, I just wanted to talk a little bit more as well about the risks in the sector that companies are exposed to. So companies that have electronics hardware manufacturing are exposed to a range of forced labor risks. So just as a few examples, there was a study earlier this year that linked over 70 global companies across sectors, but many in the ICT sector, to sourcing from factories that employ forced labor in China. We've also seen in our benchmark this year that the number of allegations has really increased quite significantly. We had allegations regarding 14 companies this year, up from only 3 last time. We did increase the number of companies from 40 to 49, but still that's quite a strong increase here. Also, the majority of companies are sourcing from China and or Malaysia. And in both of those countries are, as in many other countries, high risks of forced labor. So, and these come at a great cost for both workers, but also for companies. And just to give you a bit of a sense, as an example, in Malaysia, a study last year found that workers had to pay several months of wages just in order to get a job. I think the average was sort of a number of workers reported 4 to 5 months of wages. Some workers even up to 8 months of wages just in order to get a job, which obviously then puts them into a cycle of debt. a number of companies have now committed to improve and ensure that workers don't have to pay these fees, but it actually ends up being a really high cost for companies or their suppliers as well. If they are serious about repaying these fees. And one company, for example, reported that their suppliers reimbursed up to 30 million in such worker paid recruitment fees. One thing I also just wanted to mention is that there are obviously very much heightened risks due to the crisis. So we've seen negative impacts of the COVID crisis on workers and electronic supply chains really across regions. We've seen a loss of wages where production had stopped. We've seen workers being restricted in their movement, stranded and unable to return home, for example. We've seen suspension of collective bargaining agreements. We've seen workers that had been in Italy, for example, that had been laid off despite government support for companies. And we've also seen workers being exposed to severe health and safety risks. For example, in India, workers in the electronic sector were threatened to not having paid their wages if they don't return to work despite severe risks. And the Responsible Business Alliance, the biggest industry initiative in that sector that focuses on hardware manufacturing, also is actually checking on a monthly basis just data on how supply chains are working during the crisis. And one factor they're assessing is to what extent workers are getting paid that weren't able to return to work. And you see here the number on the slide, it's only 35% of factories, so that's also quite low. And just wanted to maybe finish with that quote of that worker here that really has been talking, rather than being able to support their family, which was the reason for taking the job, they are now reliant on their families for food and for support. So with that, I just wanted to give a quick note on our methodology and how we undertake our benchmark. So the methodology is based on the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And we look at to what extent companies meet also the ILO core labor standards. We do that by looking at information that companies disclose, both of their own websites, but then we also engage with companies. So we share our initial findings with them and invite them over a period of 3 months to have calls with us to better understand those findings, but also to provide more information. And about 50% of the companies have done that, have engaged with us. 38% have provided more information. Another quarter of the companies had engaged with us outside that 3-month period. And about a quarter of companies haven't engaged with us at all. In addition to these corporate disclosure, we also take into consideration publicly available forced labor allegations, and also give some credit for companies participating in relevant multi-stakeholder initiatives or industry initiatives. And with that, I wanted to share the benchmark itself. So you see it here. You see the scores are ranging from 0 up to 70. The total possible score is 100. You see even the highest scoring companies here quite a bit far off here. The average score is 30 out of 100, so you see quite a few companies around here. But also probably notable that 3/4 of the companies score less than 50%. So the majority are really in this bottom section here, and only few companies have taken further steps. One thing that was really interesting for us as well is the strong correlation with the finding that Camille will share later, which we have found over time as well. And in terms of so when we assess companies, we look at 7 different themes. So starting with, does a company have a commitment to address forced labor? Does it have a supplier code that covers forced labor? Is there internally someone responsible for implementing that code? But then also looking at things like, does the company assess risks? Does it adopt responsible purchasing practices? Work towards addressing exploitation of migrant workers through recruitment agencies, etc. And you see here quite strongly, and that's really something that's held true over time, but also across sectors, that companies, unsurprisingly, tend to be strongest when it comes to commitment and governance. Also on the theme of monitoring, companies tend to be a little bit stronger. I think especially the ICT sector is very heavily audit focused. And then purchasing practices, and in particular, worker voice are the lowest scoring themes. So in worker voice, for example, in this particular sector, we all of the companies scored 0 when it came to supporting workers in their supply chains in terms of exercising their right to freedom of association and collective bargaining. Just to delve a little bit more into some of those details, I think one thing we've also found really across themes is sort of this gap between policies on the one hand side, but then the implementation on the other side. For example, when we look at grievance mechanisms, you see here that the majority of companies does say that there is a grievance mechanism available for workers in their supply chains. But as soon as we ask, how has that mechanism been communicated to supply chain workers, or is there any evidence that any workers have used such a mechanism, there's typically only a few companies that can respond to that. Similarly, when it comes to the theme of recruitment, most companies, which is very exciting, have now really committed to prohibit worker-paid recruitment fees in their supply chains and committed to the employer pays principle, which means that not the worker has to pay for the costs of the recruitment, but the employer. And so about 3/4 of the companies have committed to that. But again, when it comes to implementation, we see a very big gap. So only about 1/4 of the companies remediate these fees to workers. You also see here, we haven't actually seen any company that's integrated it into its purchasing practices. And then also when it comes to, I mentioned earlier, we look at specific allegations as well and how companies respond to those. We've seen very few companies that report remedy outcomes for workers and how they engage with affected stakeholders. And yeah, here just a quick overview. I think I mentioned most things already. Just I think it's quite useful to keep in mind. One of the things that I think benchmarks can do is just show you where sectors are at and what companies typically have in place and what they don't. And I think a lot of the things where there are gaps is really in terms of implementation and evidence of outcomes for workers and worker-centric approaches. On the other hand, we're seeing in the sector a lot of companies have strong policies in place, are also most of them, for example, trained suppliers and internal staff on forced labor policies. Most have an audit process in place. I mentioned earlier we are engaging with, so I should have actually said we are assessing 60 companies in the ICT sector. So we're engaging with all of those companies, as well as with companies in other sectors, but also engaging with investors. So we have, for example, an investor statement that's supported by investors with over 6 trillion assets under management. We are supporting investors that want to engage with companies in the benchmark. And we've also seen some examples where companies improved really strongly following investor engagement, either through shareholder resolutions or through one-to-one or also collaborative dialogues with companies. And finally, I wanted to share how you as the audience can use the data. I think that's what we really wanted to do in this session. So I think the benchmark data can really help you understand what are the risks, right, in this sector. So what are forced labor risks for workers, but also for companies and also their investors? So what are the risks they're exposed to? The benchmarks can also help you understand performance of individual companies, but then also of the industry at large. And also give you specific recommendation for both the industry and individual companies. It allows you to compare peers, allows you to learn what good practice looks like, but also look at findings. If you're based in a particular region, if you're interested in a specific topic or subsector, that's something that the benchmarks can do as well. And for that, I just wanted to quickly share with you our website. So this is the KnowtheChain website. You can here find a number of resources, more information about us, but then also the benchmark data. And either you can search directly for a specific company, or you can look up, a specific sector information for a specific year. This is here the latest information for the ICT sector. You can then also find the relevant findings report. And as I just said already, but you couldn't see, so just taking again the example of recruitment, for example, just looking at more specifically the findings on that theme. You could do that in the report, but you can also on the website, look at a specific theme like, recruitment, for example. And you'll see here then the average score for the theme. You see which companies come at the top. But maybe you're also interested how companies are doing in terms of market cap, where some larger companies are doing well, but some, other larger companies here, or even scoring 0 here, are not doing that well. You can also just reverse the scoring and just the other way around, see which companies score at the bottom on this particular theme. So for anyone that's interested to dive more into the topic, I think that might be useful. The other thing as well, if you are interested in a specific location, say, for example, if you're, looking for just findings on Japanese companies, you can then see, what's the average score for these, who's scoring highest, who's scoring lowest. Equally, if, for example, you only want to look at US companies, and I probably should have mentioned, we look at the largest companies globally. So for that sector, it means we have a lot of North American, specifically US companies, but also a number of Asian and a few European companies in there. So you can also do that. We also have a translations page, which has some information available in different languages, not everything, but certainly some, and you're certainly welcome to contact us if you feel there's anything missing. And lastly, maybe to say as well, if you're interested in, say, a specific subsector, then you could select that here as well. You can also, if you want to look more at a specific company, you can look at their page specifically. You can then see also more details in terms of how they score. You could download a company scorecard that has more specific information on how the company does in comparison to their peers, but then also has company-specific commendations, but then also recommendations. And you can also compare companies to each other. So, for example, if you wanted to see how some companies compare to each other, you can then see on certain themes, for example, on worker voice, you see the yellow one, Dell is stronger, but on other themes like recruitment, for example, HPE is stronger. So you could look or point the company to other peers that might have stronger practices in place. So I appreciate that was very fast, but I hope that gave you a bit of an overview. And with that, I'd like to hand it back to Lourdes.
Thanks, Felicitas. Excellent presentation, getting to know how these ICT companies are doing on the ground with recruiting their workers. I'd like to call on Camille to present a more holistic point of view of how ICT companies are performing on human rights. And perhaps after that, we can see a contrast between the two that can lead to a more dynamic discussion after. Camille, over to you.
Great. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I'll give a brief overview of the CHRB framework, but so focusing on the ICT benchmark and how to use the results. So quite similarly to what Felicitas just presented. So first, some background about the CHRB for those not so familiar with it. We benchmark the largest global companies from high-risk sectors on their human rights performance. And we are part of the larger World Benchmarking Alliance, or WBA, as Lourdes mentioned earlier, whose mission is to benchmark 2,000 of the largest and most influential companies on their contribution to achieving the SDGs. So coming back to the CHRB more specifically, we have published 3 benchmarks to date, and we looked at 4 sectors until now, so agricultural products, apparel, extractives, and crucially for today, ICT manufacturing. And we have a methodology that's based on 6 measurement themes, which you can see on the slide. So as I said, 2019 was our 3rd benchmark. So our 3rd cycle, it was published in mid-November of last year, so that's the latest results. We added 100 companies in 2019, bringing the total number of companies up to 200, and 40 of these are ICT companies. Each company is assessed on about 50 indicators that are split across the 6 measurement themes that you've got on the slide. And the methodology, so similarly to the chain methodology, it is very much grounded on internationally recognized instruments, such as the ILO core labor standards, but also crucially the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. The assessment is based exclusively on publicly available information. So that's information that companies disclose, but also information from third parties when it comes to serious allegations of negative human rights impacts. We engage with about 2/3 of the companies in scope. Engagement is entirely optional, so it's up to the companies to engage with us, given that, as I said, we look at publicly available information, so it's not based on a survey or a questionnaire. But we have found that engagement is quite useful. From our point of view, it's useful to understand better the internal dynamics of companies, but also what might not be so clear about the assessment framework. And then we've heard from companies that it was useful for them to have the opportunity to provide feedback on their draft assessment, but also to have more direct dialogue with CHRB to understand the methodology requirements. Okay, so that's probably enough for general framing. Looking at the 2019 results. So very quickly, this slide is the overall results. So looking across all sectors to give an overview, and then I'll go more in depth into the ICT results specifically. But what you can see on the graph is the number of companies in each scoring band, bearing in mind that the maximum score would be 100. So, for example, looking at the column furthest to the left, what we see is that 49 companies scored between 0 and 10%. And again, this is 49 out of 200. So that's nearly a quarter of companies scoring less than 10%. You've got the average score, that's 24%. It was actually a bit lower than the average score in 2018. And that was in large part due to the fact that new companies that were added in 2018 scored lower, and that included the ICT companies. And so that pulled the overall average down. So the scores are low. This is concerning because what this signals is low levels of implementation of the UN guiding principles in major companies in high-risk sectors. And if we look at the measurement theme level, we can see that results are actually low across the board. So now looking at ICT manufacturing more specifically, so we looked at 40 of the largest ICT manufacturing companies in the world. And for all 40 of them, this was their first time being benchmarked by CHRB. So we only have their 2019 results. And just as a side note, these 40 companies were selected to align with the KnowtheChain 2018 benchmark list, so that we could have a comparison on the results. So on the slide, you've got the distribution of companies according to their the number of companies scoring in each band. So similar to the previous slides in terms of presentation, but you probably noticed that the spread is more narrow with no company scoring above 50%. And to some extent, it is a bit unfair to compare ICT companies with all other companies, given that they were being assessed for the first time. But we did see a clear lower average for the sector with only 18%. So we feel that the sector appears to have been somewhat chasing regulation with a focus on certain issues, which might explain why on the CHRB, which looks more holistically at human rights, as Lourdes said, the results are lower. But I'll come back to this in a minute. On the slide, you've got a table with the 40 companies that we assessed in ICT by ranking order, and you've got some key information in the table with the red flags indicating where there was at least one serious allegation meeting the CHRB severity threshold against that company. The red X marks show where we have not had any engagement with the company. So the company has not answered any of our communications and has not inputted into the research through providing feedback or pointing us to additional sources. And finally, the exclamation mark means a company scored 0 on all 5 human rights due diligence indicators. So companies not disclosing information about how they identify, prioritize, and manage their human rights risks. So if we look at these results, the initial picture for the ICT sector is not looking great. However, if we look at progress over time for the other sectors, we can be hopeful that we might see something similar for ICT companies. So looking back at the sectors that have been assessed since 2017, we did see some progress. So on the slide now is the original distribution in 2017. Then 18 months later, in 2018, we started to see a shift away from the lowest scoring bands. And then in 2019, we saw an even greater shift. And again, this is looking only at the companies that had been assessed since 2017. But even for these, even if we're seeing an increase in the average score, we're still a long way from a normal distribution around the 60% mark. So this means that even if we're hopefully going to see a similar trend with ICT companies, progress would actually have to be much faster than what we've seen so far. A few other key findings from the data. So like KnowtheChain, the CHRB assessment of ICT manufacturing companies focuses on human rights risks associated with the manufacturing and raw material sourcing of electronic devices. So it doesn't look at so-called downstream or end-user human rights issues such as digital rights. And this is in part because these are covered in other initiatives such as ranking digital rights. And Lourdes will hopefully also tell us a bit more about her work around digital inclusion a bit later. But focusing on the upstream for now, so the CHRB and KnowtheChain rankings are generally well aligned. So with a correlation of 0.8, Felicitas said 0.89, so it's even higher with the latest KnowtheChain results. However, what we see is that scores are on average higher in KnowtheChain than CHRB. So there's a correlation when we look at the ranking, but scores are generally a bit lower overall in CHRB. And this could indicate that ICT manufacturing companies in scope tend to focus more efforts on specific human rights issues, such as forced labor or digital rights, at the expense of a more holistic approach to human rights. And this analysis would be supported by the fact that half of the ICT manufacturing companies assessed last year failed to show to score any points in human rights due diligence, which looks at risks in a holistic and systematic way. So the bullet points are reversed on the slide. What the results also showed is that 33 out of 40 of the companies in scope have a basic commitment to respect human rights. However, when we dig a bit deeper, even looking just at commitment, only one company out of 40 has a more advanced commitment to respect labour rights, so looking at core ILO standards. and with freedom of association and collective bargaining as key areas of weakness. We saw particularly low scores relating to child labour for ICT manufacturing. And we also notice when we look at the full data set that companies that disclose that board remuneration is linked to human rights score 60% on average, and not a single ICT company met that requirement. So again, something that highlights low performance. Now, very quickly on who uses the results and how. So different stakeholders inevitably use the information in different ways. So for companies, as Felicitas highlighted, the results provide a useful understanding as to what others in their peer group are doing, and what can be considered best practice within the sector, but also what gaps are currently present in their own processes and reporting, which they can improve on. For investors, the CHRB has two fundamental purposes. The first one is to inform investment research and decisions across portfolios. And then the second one is to inform company engagement and shareholder advocacy. So some examples of investor action to note would be systematic voting that some investors are doing against senior executive in charge of human rights at AGMs if they score less than 10% on the CHRB, or shareholder resolutions filed against specific companies, or collective engagement, such as when coalitions of investors target specific low-scoring companies and ask them to improve on a specific area. Now, there are also uses of the results for other stakeholders, like governments, where the results can be used to provide information on how effectively businesses have been adopting UNGPs and inform where particular areas of weakness may require additional regulation. And some governments have also commissioned third-party assessments based on a subset of the CHRB methodology to assess companies in a particular country or region. This is the case for Belgium and Finland this year, for example. And then we've also seen the results being used in the media to target low-scoring companies particularly. So this is not so much a user of the data as a vector to highlight the results further for others to use the results. But we've seen some positive reactions from some companies after they've been called out in the media. So where you can find the results, they're all publicly available on the website. What's available is a key findings report with some analysis. We also have banding tables, bar graphs, and other infographics to make sense of this large data set in a more intuitive way, individual company scorecards, and a master data sheet with all the results in one place. So similarly to what Felicitas just did, I'm just going to show you quickly how you can access those on the website. If I can share my screen. Okay, you should be able to see my screen now. So here's the website. So that's the homepage with, again, graphs. You've got a banding table with all the different companies in each band, and then results at the measurement theme level. But perhaps more importantly, to dig into the data set is the download data page, where you can look at specific company scorecards for each of the different years that we've been looking at companies. So looking at ICT manufacturing, for example, Amazon, there you've got the detail of the assessment with the results at the indicator level, the explanation, and the sources that were used in the assessment, and then the scores at overall and measurement theme level. And you can also download the full data set. So when you click on that button, you end up downloading this big spreadsheet, which is by no means a beautiful, pretty document, but it's quite useful to play around with the data. You can have an overview, you can look at different sectors, and you also have the full data set in this tab with essentially every single company scorecard pasted in one place. So if you're interested in, say, human rights defenders, you can filter to the relevant indicator. You want to see best practice, you filter to 2 out of 2, and then you've got examples, the companies that scored maximum points, and the explanation for how they did that. So again, a big spreadsheet with the data in a raw format, but the idea is to make it possible for users to play around with it according to their interest. So I should probably stop here and hand back to you, Lourdes.
Thanks, Camille. It's both very fascinating as well as alarming what you and Felicitas has been showing through the data on the performance of ICT companies on human rights. It's interesting to contrast this work with the upcoming benchmark that we are going to publish for the World Benchmarking Alliance, the 2020 debut of the Digital Inclusion Benchmark. The approach is different, the philosophy is different, but I think the end view is that it gives us a 3D picture of the industry from different angles. So the Digital Inclusion Benchmark essentially looks at how companies are contributing to making sure that no one is left behind in terms of digital technologies. Everyone share equally in the benefits of the digital economy, and that we mitigate risks and harms. And these risks and harms can arise from digital rights issues such as privacy, for example, or security, or it can arise from labor rights. And the WBA itself is working to look at core social expectations for companies across all 2,000 of the most influential companies for SDGs. So that should give us, when that comes out later this year, that should give us a really like 3D picture on the sector, though we cover not only the hardware, but also telcos and platforms. I'd like to kickstart the discussion. We have a few questions from the audience. Before we get into that, I'd like to kickstart the discussion with question for both Camille and Felicitas. Just curious, based on the CHRB and KnowtheChain data, do we find that if companies are more advanced in their, holistic approach to human rights, do we also find that these companies perform better on specific labor rights in the supply chain issue? Or do we find that there's a disconnect somewhere? And usually, where is that disconnect? What could be examples of that disconnect? Camille or Felicitas, over to you.
Yeah, happy to kick off. So I think, Lourdes, so overall, I think we're seeing certainly a strong connect. So there is a strong correlation between KnowtheChain and the CHRB results. And if a company scores well on the CHRB, it also scores well on KnowtheChain. I think so that's sort of a very broad average. I think what Camille already mentioned is that what's quite interesting, though, and that really holds true across sectors, that companies tend to score higher on KnowtheChain. And I think that's really due to a lot of the reporting legislation, for example. So, with the 49 companies, ICT companies that we assessed, for example, 47 of them have to report under the UK Modern Slavery Act, a number of them also under the California legislation. So, and that forces companies to say at least something about forced labor, right? But also, I think what we've seen, right, even within our themes, is that companies, we've seen stronger improvements in areas such as recruitment, so the various specific aspects of forced labor, and a lot less improvement on things like worker voice and purchasing practices, which are very much needed to ultimately address forced labor, but which weren't so much as the focus as Camille already mentioned. On the flip side, we have seen sometimes companies that have very large of their own manufacturing operations that might have done work there, but haven't necessarily looked at their supply chains yet. But you could argue in those cases they haven't actually undertaken a holistic due diligence yet, because they haven't looked at their supply chains yet. But so sometimes we do see companies that are sort of much stronger on their own operations and not their supply chain.
Yeah, and just to add to this, so yeah, this is, as I said, something we're seeing, and one thing we're thinking is the reason why companies aren't scoring so well on CHRB is this targeted approach, as Felicitas said, based on disclosure regulations. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not thinking about these other issues and doing work internally, but they've not been prompted as much to disclose about it. So given that both KnowtheChain and CHRB look at publicly available information to drive transparency, this can also explain the lower scores. So lower transparency levels, not necessarily equating with lower performance and attention, but definitely when we look at the human rights due diligence area of the assessment, we do see that companies provide information about specific topics, and what we're looking for there is really this more overarching systematic assessment of human rights risks that takes into account any risks associated with the company's manufacturing and operations and supply chain. So yeah, we're kind of looking at it from the other side. Companies doing better overall tend to do better on specific issues, but doing better on specific issues doesn't mean they're doing better overall.
And as Felicitas have said, if they're not really doing better on those specific issues, it's hard to claim that they're also really doing better on the more holistic angle. It would be very fascinating to contrast this with the digital inclusion benchmark results that will be coming up, because there is overlap and intersection. Many of the companies, I think, in the ICT manufacturing space are also in our group of hardware companies in the benchmark. So we'd get a more holistic picture on how they're contributing towards, access for all in terms of technology. And if we talk about access, it's really inclusion also starts from your own operations, which is from your own business, from how you treat your workers, both within you and in your supply chain as well. So that should be really interesting. Maybe we can go to a quick question from the audience. I think we have Shannon who asks, Sematech is a pre-competitive consortium where semiconductor manufacturers agree on technical standards so that chips are interoperable. So Shannon is asking, have they considered, or you, Camille and Felicitas, considered integrating labor standards, or have you reached out to them to see if they are considering integrating labor standards?
Maybe just to kick off, we are certainly across sectors trying to engage with initiatives in those sectors. So in the ICT sector specifically, we've been focusing most strongly on the Responsible Business Alliance, given that they have members that include semiconductor companies, but also really other subsectors, so including hardware technology companies, equipment manufacturers, etc. So quite a range of companies. So we had been focusing on the RBA most strongly in this particular sector, but I think that sounds like a great suggestion. So thank you, Shannon.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. So we've also been in touch with RBA a lot, given the kind of dominance of electronic manufacturers in their members. But we're actually undertaking a big methodology review currently of the CHRB methodology and processes, and we're trying to involve and get input from as many stakeholders as possible. So it sounds like Sematech would be a good one to reach out to. So we'll make sure to do that. And if you've got contacts actually and are able to connect us, that would be particularly useful.
Indeed, Shannon, we'd be very happy to be introduced to Sematech people. So please feel free to get in touch with us. For the WBA's digital inclusion benchmark, we do have indicators related to interoperability. as we see that as a crucial component of inclusion, especially for the innovation measurement area. So that drives prices down, that ensures that companies are not free riding essentially on the work in the sector. So I'd also be personally interested to get to know Stematech's work. We have a few minutes remaining, but we do have time for more interaction. So please feel free to post questions in the chat. I do have some additional questions to Camille and Felicitas. Since now we're looking at different dimensions essentially of how ICT manufacturers are performing, I would wonder from your perspective, what if these ICT manufacturers span the whole gamut of the digital ecosystem? So they don't just manufacture, this is pretty common, they don't just manufacture items, they also are platforms, they're also involved in software, in some cases, they're also in network connectivity. So how should they prioritize, how should they prioritize efforts across human rights, labor rights in the supply chain, maybe even digital rights? Like how should they do this? What would best practice look like in essence?
Happy to go first for this one, Felicitas. So, I mean, quoting specific companies, I think there were 3 companies in the 2019 CHRB list that were also on the ranking digital rights. So they were assessed kind of both aspects, the manufacturing and the digital rights. That's Apple, Microsoft, and Samsung. And so we definitely encourage users of the results to look at both CHRB, KnowtheChain, but also the ranking digital rights dataset to get a full picture. So, because they're kind of essentially the short answer is it's all important to get a full picture of a company's human rights performance. In terms of prioritization from the company's point of view internally, this is where having a robust risk assessment and risk management, so human rights due diligence process, comes into play, because depending on the company's profile, the regions where it operates, it won't have the same risk profile. So a company might have more digital rights risks than manufacturing risks, depending on, again, the region where it operates, the sort of supply chain that it works with. So it's something, there's no universal template to apply to companies, as in digital rights is more important or manufacturing rights, labor rights is more important. It will really depend on each company's profile.
Thanks, Camille.
To add to that, I think I would concur with everything that Camille said. And just to say, I think, looking at the guiding principles and undertaking a human rights impact assessment on a regular basis gives you exactly that, right? Like you understand where are impacts most severe on people, but also understanding where your leverage is, right? And actually, as Camille said, I think even within one company, these impacts might change over time, right? Like, for example, you might change your sourcing, but also it might, governments might change, which might increase or decrease risk to people, or checks on companies in certain regions, for example, or there might be more regulations on privacy, for example. So just undertaking regular impact assessments and from there looking at where risk to people are the greatest, I think is a really good starting point.
Thanks, Felicitas and Camille. We do have a couple of questions for the audience, and I think this is just right for the time we have remaining. So we have Remy asks if there are available human rights due diligence tools specifically for ICT manufacturers. And May asks, how do you decide which company to reach out to?
So in terms of the first question on tools available for ICT companies, specifically in terms of human rights due diligence, so I'd say in a way the beauty of the human rights due diligence framework is that it can be applied to any company in any sector, any geography, because it's a set of key questions and different steps in the process. So it's first identifying the human rights risks that your business is exposed to, then assessing those to identify the most salient ones. So that's those that pose the highest level of risk to the potentially affected stakeholder. And then once you've identified these and prioritized them, putting in place an action plan to manage these risks and then track the effectiveness of these actions. So in that sense, human rights due diligence is a process, kind of a learning, like a useful tool to identify risks. So it's not tailored for a specific industry in that sense. Having said that, there will be specific groups that can help you go through the different steps, so identifying the risks, etc. And I think this is where business initiatives can really help. So perhaps I'll stop there to see if Felicitas wants to add anything before we go to the other question.
Yeah, just to say that I think, one of the ways the benchmark can help you is just that, as Camille said, right, you can take this whole massive data file and just filter for the human rights due diligence indicators and see what are the types of actions that some of the highest scoring companies have taken, maybe even like who they worked with, how they went about it, what the kind of resources they used. And then just in terms of how do we decide which companies we reach out to. So we look at, first of all, we looked at which are the sectors at most risk for forced labor, and ICT was certainly one of them. But then we looked at the largest global companies, given that they, tend to have the largest supply chains, the largest impact of workers, but also, the biggest leverage, right? And so, we're looking at, largest companies globally, and then by market cap and reaching out to those, but trying to engage with initiatives such as RBA and others to also just engage companies beyond the largest.
Yeah, and it's the same selection criteria for CHRB. Currently, one thing we're considering is expanding the selection criteria so that we include companies that are not publicly listed, because currently the list is limited to these. So that's one thing we could do. But once companies are selected, we essentially reach out to all of them. So we communicate with all of the companies in scope throughout the process, and then it's up to the companies to decide how much or whether they want to engage.
And maybe just as one last thought is just that we sometimes get asked from companies if they can opt in or opt out, and I think speak for both benchmarks that we assess the largest globally because we think they have significant impact, so they cannot opt out, but equally others cannot simply opt in either, because we actually also got feedback from a number of companies that they feel the process is really helpful and gives them an assessment on where they're doing, where they could improve. So that's why certainly we've also been asked by other companies if they could opt in. But again, though, both of our methodologies are freely available. So we certainly welcome if companies use that as well.
Good point, Felicitas. We certainly get asked those questions as well. And I'm always fond of saying with great power comes great responsibility. So in the digital inclusion benchmark, we cover 100, for 2020, we cover 100 of the world's most influential digital technology companies, from Adobe to ZTE, so A to C literally, comparing apples and oranges literally. And so it's really about whether these companies are important in influencing change and having the impact. So it's not whether they want to be in or out. I think we have time for just one more question before our call to action and our wrap up. Again, we have something from Shannon who asks, are the companies you're engaging with aware that U.S. Customs can seize and destroy shipments and credible accusations of forced or child labor, and that the burden of proof will be on them to demonstrate that these goods were not made with either. She says only about 50 shipments have been seized ever, but more this year than in the past year, and there's public commitment to use this mechanism more. So she's wondering if this risk will make them more willing to take the mitigations you're interested in.
Do you want to go ahead, Felicitas? Or?
Happy for you. Go ahead.
I'm just going to say, like, not to speak for the companies, because obviously, even though we engage with them, we can't be sure of what they see as priorities. But I mean, definitely any of regulation that's introduced that forces companies to pay more attention to these issues and adds incentives, negative and positive, for them to do that, tend to have an effect that's in line with what we're trying to promote. So I would say yes, definitely.
Yeah, I think I would say the same. And I think we've certainly also seen, there was a first question around, do we think companies are aware of these? And we've certainly generally haven't seen a very strong awareness of companies around regulation, or also a very quick response when it comes to taking action just in response to specific legislation rather than voluntary standards or commitments. And so yeah, as Camille said, I think just this increase of regulations and legislations, we certainly hope and have seen over time companies improve, albeit slowly. So I do think they certainly have an impact and will lead to greater company action.
So you're saying, Felicitas, that they definitely sit up and take immediate action when it comes to regulation. Unfortunately, sometimes regulation can be behind the curve. So then we have room for soft instruments and voluntary instruments such as benchmarks like KnowtheChain and the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark and the Digital Inclusion Benchmark to move the sector forward. Anyway, we have 1 minute left, so let's close the session. Call to action is essentially, please, you're invited to use the benchmark results. Felicitas has shown you the website and where to download the data, and Camille as well has shown you that. So please feel free to use the data for your advocacy, for policy learning, for shareholder engagement. It's there, it's available, it's public, and it's free. And also feel free to be in touch with any of us should you have further questions and comments. And with that, I close and thank everyone for their time. Thank you.